I am returning from my time in the woods, which was time well spent, and I'll share those photos should you be interested. So I wanted to talk about externalities. So this is a concept in economics in which the external cost of maybe a supply chain or of producing a particular product, the manufacturing, or the service costs of a particular service do not include an externality. So it's something that is costly but is external to the cost benefit or the cost analysis of the particular production or product or the supply of that product. You get me, I think. Alright, so for example, there is an external cost or an externality to my body when I'm doing physical labor, or your body when you're doing physical labor, right? Or there's an external cost to your body if you're sitting at a desk job for 10 hours a day, right? So that cost to your body of the work that you provide and the product that is produced as a result of that work is not included in the cost analysis necessarily. For your salary or the budget of the entire organization you might work for, or the business. I don't include the wear and tear on my body for climbing trees. That's the best analogy I've got right now. So, external costs are talked about a lot in terms of ecosystem services and ecology, because we don't include those costs that we all incur or impact our lives, but are not necessarily all aware of. So, for example, if a particular, this is kind of a classic, technology or business is bad example. Corporations are bad kind of example, even though they're people too, according to the Supreme Court, which I don't really understand, but that's a whole other thing, right? If like an IBM or some other company like that, back in the 70s and the 60s, filled huge pits with computer chips and other microprocessor type materials, and then filled those pits in, and then paid the government a little bit of money to buy that land, fill it with their trash, and then move on. And now we have this thing called a Superfund site, because it turns out that those components that they buried, they didn't bury them properly, perhaps out of ignorance probably, and they leaked a lot of heavy metals, and those heavy metals can actually travel into the water system or into the water table, and that water table is used by the entire town within which or nearby to that Superfund site. The external cost of that Superfund site and that choice of waste disposal is not realized, so it is not included in the cost of managing that city and managing the health care for that city or municipality. So it's not included in the cost of keeping that water clean and free of those heavy metals. The external cost for services provided by soil to or plants that can pick up those heavy metals and then relocate them to an area where they're not going to impact the water table or directly impact human health. Those are external to how a system or a product is priced. So how those computers or the computer components or our cell phones or whatever are priced, they do not consider the costs of the waste product and how that waste product has to be managed, and how if it isn't managed correctly, we end up with a poisoned environment that poisons people, that costs the cities more money to try to keep people safe, costs regulatory agencies more money to monitor that poison and plan and figure out ways to address the poisoning, and keep the healthcare system experiencing more expense because there are a lot more people who are sick and moving into emergency care or seeking care who maybe are not covered by employee health care options. So another reason, I'm really like hemming and hawing here, sorry about that. A reason that this is of such concern to ecologists, conservation biologists, ecosystem scientists, etc., is that we are losing a lot of the ecosystem services due to biodiversity loss that are considered externalities. So we don't price in the cost of losing biodiversity to our health, the cost of the loss of that biodiversity to our food supply, the loss of that biodiversity to our potential medical discoveries and their pharmaceutical development, the cost of that biodiversity to clean air, or also in terms of reducing the amount of diseases that are vectored or carried to us by insects and that are actually going to thrive and are thriving as a result of the climate crisis we live in. So since we do not recognize those costs, those actually opportunities, since we do not value the services that are provided by healthy soils, healthy air, and the biodiversity that is integral to creating healthy soils, which lead to healthy water, and vice versa, and healthy air, since we do not include those benefits in our cost analysis, they no longer have any sort of value in our economic system. They're external to the economic system. And then as we lose those services and increase the cost of our particular economic system, the cost it has on us as individuals, as communities, and as municipalities or cities or states or whatever, or the globe. I just lost that thought. So as we lose those costs, as we lose that value, it sort of leads to a, what's it called? I keep thinking extinction spiral. So there's this phenomena, which maybe is a good metaphor. There is in extinction phenomena in evolutionary biology, or extinction events, maybe not phenomena, extinction events, you have this situation in which as you lose a certain amount of diversity in a population, which is typically genetic diversity, then that population is more likely to have recessive traits that are expressed, or is less likely to have this sufficient immune response diversity, or arsenal, I like to call it, to fight disease. And so typically small populations with low genetic diversity are more likely to be wiped out by some sort of extreme event, or just from this thing called mutational load. And it sends that species into an extinction spiral. So it's like a tipping point. Once you hit that tipping point, it's without a lot of intervention, it's impossible to rescue that species, right? It's past the tipping point. So in terms of ecosystem services, I did a heavy sigh because from what I have read, there are multiple tipping points that human society would need to cross in order for us to sort of, I hesitate to say this because it's so depressing, and I'm only putting it out there because, one, I think this is a really opportune moment for us to rethink, and I know it's incredibly hard and probably impossible, but to rethink governance, to rethink what makes a viable economy, and to rethink the value and start to incorporate the value of ecosystem services. Scientists have been pushing for this valuation of ecosystem services, although there's been some weird arguments in science, but whatever, for a very, very long time. and only a few economists have picked up on it, and certainly the markets have not. There's some companies that understand it and have supported it when it's directly advantageous to them, I think. Hershey is an example of that, Coca-Cola. They are protecting certain forests because they need the water from those forests, and they recognize that without those tropical forests, they lose the water that they need for their production facilities, okay? So they are valuing ecosystem services, and they're no longer externalizing those services. They're including them and incorporating them into the cost of production. The conservation of those ecosystem services by conserving those biomes is included in their cost analysis, so to speak. All right, so this is a really opportune time to do that. Okay, there are several tipping points, which I won't get into, that have been modeled by a multitude of think tanks, scientists, scientists from very different countries, think tanks from very different countries, and there's a terrific couple of organizations. One is the Global Environmental Fund, the GEF, which is just an amazing place to go to for information and research, that have determined that if we cross a certain number of these threshold tipping points in terms of our consumption or our abuse, and that's my word, our abuse of natural resources and nature in general, that there's no way for us to come back without some amazing great fortune and phenomenally innovative technology. We, as a human species, is what I'm talking about, it is going to be very hard for us to come back once we've crossed those tipping points. We are excruciatingly close, if not having already passed, I'm going to just say excruciatingly close, to passing the maximum number of tipping points. So our destruction of ecosystem, which includes biodiversity, balanced nitrogen supplies in soils, different things like that, access to water, clean water, reliable access to clean water. These are some examples of the tipping points that once we no longer can rely on those ecosystem services, a certain number of them, it's a point of no return. So, I don't know how we do it. I am not that smart, I am not that sophisticated, but I know, and I think it's really, this is what's called a wicked problem. In a lot of science or engineering, there's this phraseology called wicked problems. Sustainability is a wicked problem, because how would we, everybody wants to return to normal after this crisis, and normal is just, I think, a catch-all phrase for feeling safe and stable again. But the reality is that we weren't safe and stable prior to this crisis. We're headed for a very bad experience as a globe if we don't get this climate crisis issue under control. It is already starting to impact us economically, certainly health-wise, and it will only continue to grow in terms of damage. How do we change rapidly, I don't even know if it's possible, our economic identity, our economic philosophy, our market approach, as well as our I'll just stop there. I know there's more I've got in my head, but I'm just stop there because I'm rambling. How do we change that so rapidly, even as a country? Like, how does a state do that? I don't know. Like, what would it require? It would seem like a perfect storm. You'd have to just have an amazing number of brilliant people who, one example might be how Norway took care of not falling into the issues of being an oil-rich state and then just squandering those profits. So maybe following that particular paradigm, which was having some just amazing, brilliant minds, and then a government that was open-minded and willing and aggressively dedicated to having the best outcome possible, not for individuals, but for the country as a whole, leading to a solution that really did benefit everybody. That probably is a perfect storm, right? How do you get that to happen? And then, okay, so it happens in one country, but really you need to be global because we are so interconnected, as we are seeing from these market issues in terms of supply chains and what we can get access to and what we can't get access to in this COVID crisis, based on the fact that supply chains are so diversified. You've got production of one component in one country, another in another country, and then, yeah, it's really complicated. It's a network. So I would imagine in terms of changing our economic paradigm rapidly, it just seems like it's probably impossible. But maybe it's not, and greater minds out there can chime in, except no one watches my videos. So really, for the 5 of you that do, maybe you know an economist or two with power, or someone in public service.